Hi guys, I'm Flight Lieutenant Steve Lamb. I'm one of the instructors at the Smith Barry Academy, part of the Central Flying School. Today I'm going to talk to you about armchair flying, the art of visualization. Armchair flying has been around for generations with military pilots. It's how most of us prepare for sorties, during flying training and on the front line. Even the old and bold will attest to being urged by their instructors to armchair fly their sorties. Chelsea Sullenberger credits his successful forced landing on the Hudson River to his use of visualization, picturing and preparing for emergencies in his mind. Aircraft and simulators often have limited availability, but the best things in life are free. Armchair flying needs nothing more than a quiet space and an active imagination. Some studies have even shown that sortie visualization can be as equally effective as computer-based simulator training. Almost all student pilots are urged by their QFIs to armchair fly their sorties, but despite this, there is no formal training in the use of mental imagery, and no official in-depth guidance exists. This video is designed to address that, using the most up-to-date research and evidence available. I'll first take you through the background, the need for armchair flying and what it is. Then I'll discuss the science that underpins the practice, how the brain works, the processes involved, and, most importantly, what we can do to exploit this system to its full extent. By understanding how our brain works, we can effectively hack it, often with quite astonishing results. Along the way, I'll offer you guidance on best practice, gleaned from some of the best pilots in the world, from Red Arrows to astronauts, as well as some lowly RAF and Royal Navy QFIs. So, what is armchair flying? Put in simple terms, armchair flying is the practice of sitting somewhere quiet and mentally rehearsing the sortie ahead, creating a vivid, detailed, and realistic image of the world outside, placing yourself in it, and visualizing what is to come, each check, movement, and radio call, seeing the plan in detail, and imagining the contingencies. Elite athletes and memory champions have both used what they call visualization or imagery. For athletes, it's a mental technique that programs the mind and body to respond optimally, improving physical skills and set pieces. For those competing in memory and mental challenges, it allows them to achieve incredible intellectual feats, remembering and recalling staggering amounts of information in a short period of time. As military pilots, we need a bit of both, physical prowess and mental agility. Although armchair flying has been a feature of flying training for a very long time, it was usually done in one's room in the mess and only discussed in awkward, sheepish tones. Thankfully, sports psychology and events like the World Memory Championships have both picked up the practice of visualization and really ran with it. The science associated with imagery has also made huge leaps forward in the last few decades, and what was previously a practice shrouded in mysticism can now be lent the weight of empirical evidence. The practice of visualization is fast becoming the norm in most sports. Extensive research has been done on performers ranging from tennis players to Formula One drivers, and that research is now coming back full circle to pilots. In recent years, display teams like the Blue Angels have brought armchair flying out of the officers' mess and placed it front and centre in the briefing room, conducting group imagery before every flight. So, previously sheepish instructors like myself can now extol the virtues of imagination with the full backing of peer-reviewed research and demonstrable real-world success. Even though hard scientific research on pilots using visualization might still be quite limited at this point, you'd be hard-pressed to find a successful aviator who hasn't used it to a greater or lesser extent, and many attribute their success almost entirely to this sort of practice. Here's former Royal Australian Air Force F-18 instructor and Red Bull Air Race World Champion Matt Hall. In particular, when he's speaking, I want you to listen carefully to what he says about his body's physical reaction when he is armchair flying.
I really embraced visualization at the start of my military career. That's where I really learnt the power of visualization, because you can't just go and book another hour in the Cessna to get your license. If you don't get what was required out of that one flight in your Air Force training, they don't just go, oh well, we'll just give you another hour to learn it. It's like, well, if you didn't make it, I'm sorry, you can't be a pilot. So it was very important for me to get the absolute maximum benefit out of every single hour that I flew, and that's through visualization. And visualization, you can go into so much detail. I used to visualize when I'm changing a radio frequency, where will my hand go to which knob and which way will it rotate it through how many clicks to change a frequency. That's the detail you should go into with visualization, so that when you're actually in the aircraft and air traffic says in a busy moment while you're on departure cleaning up the aircraft and setting the power, say contact departures on 123.4, you don't have to go, where is the radio, and once again, how do I set it? You go 1, 2, 3, 4, your hand reaches over here and goes this knob, click it 3 times, push the button, click it twice again, and then keep flying the aircraft. You didn't have to take your eyes off what you were doing, and it didn't consume your time and your thought process just to do a simple frequency change. So the chances of moving towards that ultimate goal of a perfect flight increase because you've already lived it the night before in a clear environment. When I'm doing my top end visualization, my heart rate goes up, I sweat when I'm in a high stress situation, when I'm pulling G in visualization, my blood pressure goes up, we've measured it, and my body responds to the visualization because I'm giving it all of the cues it would expect to hear or see or feel, and my body responds to it the way I would expect it to in the aircraft. So it's that powerful.
When Matt talked about visualizing changing the radio, he was effectively talking about moving knowledge from his working memory, where he has to work things out and think about it, into his procedural memory, where it happens without thinking. That frees up capacity and is exactly the sort of thing we're going to cover in this lesson. That increase in capacity is at the very heart of what we are trying to achieve with Armchair Flying. Here's Colonel Chris Hadfield, Canadian fast jet test pilot and commander of the International Space Station. This excerpt is taken from his book An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth, which I'd highly recommend.
I picture the most demanding challenge. I visualize what I would need to know how to do to meet it. Then I practice until I reach a level of competence where I'm comfortable that I'll be able to perform. It's what I've always done, ever since I decided I wanted to be an astronaut in 1969. And that conscious, methodical approach to preparation is the main reason I got to Houston.
For some of you, using visualization to learn and revise will open up a whole new world of possibilities. Certainly if you're anything like I was, it'll be a heaven-sent alternative to repetitive rote learning. It turns out our minds don't respond very well to brute force when it comes to cramming in information. So this new fun method was a real revelation to me. I actually started to enjoy revision and I wanted more. For the rest of you, you may have been lucky enough to be introduced to mental imagery at school or at university, in which case this lesson will hopefully just help you sharpen your abilities and expand your understanding of the underlying techniques and principles, and ideally give you some ideas on how best to apply them in the future. So, how does it work? Well, numerous studies have shown that when individuals engage in vivid imagery, their brains interpret these images as identical to reality for the purposes of learning and practicing skills. And the more realistic the imagery, the better. This is what makes armchair flying so powerful. Research indicates that imagining an activity will cause our brains to interpret the images and fire our muscles as if we were actually doing the deed. This allows pilots to practice maneuvers, procedures, strategies, and mental skills without needing an aircraft or a simulator. In this lesson, we'll look at how our brains process information to learn and create memories. Then we'll discover how to hack this process to our advantage. There are 6 types of memories. We'll look at each in turn. Then we'll talk about the learning process itself, which is done in 5 stages. We are going to stray a short way into basic neuroscience, but I want you to stay with me. It's important to understand the internal workings if we are going to manipulate them. So let's look at those 6 types of memory. The first is episodic memory. This is recalling past events or experiences, usually closely linked with sensory and emotional information. Basically an episode in your life, like your last birthday or what you had for breakfast this morning. Second is semantic memory. This is retaining factual information, such as the name of a capital city or the gear limiting speed. Far less entertaining, but a big part of our job. Next is working memory, otherwise known as short-term memory. This is temporary information kept active by 2 neural circuits and incorporate the sensory cortices and the frontal lobes. It typically holds between 7 and 9 bits of information and will last between half a second and 10 minutes. When air traffic passes you a frequency, this is where it goes. Number 4 is procedural memory. This is using learned actions that require no conscious recall, such as riding a bike. You have no doubt heard of it referred to as muscle memory, which is a little bit misleading, but it gets the idea across. For a lot of what we teach at military flying training, this is the holy grail. Operating the aircraft becoming instinctual and natural, happening without conscious effort. Number 5 is implicit memory. This is the resurfacing of an unconscious memory that influences behaviour. It has similarities with procedural memory, but it's achieved without conscious thought. Think earworms, knowing the words or humming a tune to a song without even realising. How this works is fascinating, but because it's unconscious, it lies outside the scope of what we can easily influence, so we'll set it aside for now. These first 5 types are what we call genuine memories. They actually happened, to the best of our recollection. Of these 5, the ones we're particularly interested in are episodic, semantic, and procedural. We need to be able to remember the lessons we've been taught in the air, the information we have read on the ground, and our ultimate aim is to transfer as many elements of the flying act as possible into procedural memory, just like riding a bike. This frees up vital capacity for other tasks, which is the very crux of military aviation. The last memory type is imagined scenarios. We are able to use our imaginations to create new experiences from scratch. If used correctly, this can be a very powerful tool. For it to work, we must learn how to develop 2 skills: vividness and controllability in our imagery. Pilots often spend too much time replaying their poor performances in their minds. Those of us who've been through flying training can certainly recall the nights after a sortie when we have repeatedly mulled over our errors. Student pilots are particularly bad at getting stuck in a loop of negative imagery, fixating on their mistake and failures. You must learn how to imagine and visualize the correct actions we want, not remember the incorrect actions we may have taken on the last trip. It's vital that you understand this point. When you make a mistake, identify the correct course of action and take that lesson away from the future. But that's it. Continuing to focus on what went wrong beyond that is completely unproductive and is in fact a form of negative learning that can do harm. The more you armchair fly, the more you'll increase your ability to control the images in your mind. And as time goes by, you'll be able to craft your visualization into productive learning and away from damaging imagery. This is the essence of controllability. To use armchair flying effectively, we also need to look at the 3 key principles of memory. These are imagination, association, and location. The ancient Greeks discovered these principles, but modern science has since confirmed them. The most important of these 3 pillars is imagination. The Greeks realized that for something to be memorable, it must be a vivid and multi-sensory image. However, imagination is also the driving force behind all creativity and the foundation of all intelligence. Albert Einstein once said, "Imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating process, giving birth to evolution." The second key principle is association. The Greeks also realized that memory was in large part based on association, that it worked by linking things together. For example, as soon as your brain remembers the word apple, it will recall colors, tastes, textures, and smells of that fruit, as well as linking it to experiences, friends, or facts connected with it. You might, for instance, suddenly remember the story of Isaac Newton under the tree having his epiphany about gravity. This is also called linking, and it's one of the most important processes in the brain, and one we can use to our advantage. Here's a wonderfully illustrated example from a fantastic scene in the film Saving Private Ryan.
I can't see my brother's faces. And I've been trying, and I can't see their faces at all. Has that ever happened to you?
You got to think of the context.
What does that mean?
Well, you don't just think about their faces. You think about something specific. Something you've done together. When I think of home, I think of something specific. I think of my hammock in the backyard. My wife pruning the rose bushes and a pair of my old work gloves.
This one night, 2 of my brothers came and woke me up in the middle of the night. They said they had a surprise for me. So they took me to the barn, up into the loft, and there was my oldest brother, Dan, with Alice Jardine. I mean, picture a girl who just took a nosedive from the ugly tree and hit every branch coming down. and Dan's got her shirt up. He's working on this bra and he's trying to get it off, and all of a sudden John just screams out, Danny, you're a young man. Don't do it. And so Alice Jardine hears this and she screams and she jumps up and she tries to get running out of the barn, but she's still got this shirt over her head. She goes running right into the wall and knocks herself out. So now Dan is just so mad at us. He starts coming after us. But at the same time, Alice is over there unconscious. He's got to wake her up. So he grabs her by a leg, and he's dragging her. At the same time, he picks up a shovel, and he's going after Sean. And Sean's saying, "What are you trying to hit me for? I just did you a favor." And so this makes Dan more angry. He tries to swing this thing. He loses the shovel, goes out of his grasp, and hits a kerosene lantern. The thing explodes. The whole barn almost goes up because of this thing.
As well as demonstrating the power of association, this also shows how vivid images are recalled much easier. The final pillar is location. For your brain to remember something that it has imagined and associated, it must also have that memory or image in a specific location. Think of your brain as a library. Finding one book amongst 1 million would be an almost impossible task if, instead of using a logical system of filing in relevant locations, all the books were simply piled on the floor. Creating imaginary places or hooks within your mind on which information can be stored is referred to as the method of Loki, but you might also have heard it referred to as a memory palace or a mind palace. It's rapidly gained in popularity this century, and it's actually become a mainstay of academic achievement, as well as the primary tool used by memory champions. Here's an example of how effective it can be.
You can actually train memory. We all know you can improve it, but to see an Alex Mullen memorizing a deck of cards in under 17 seconds.
Alex Mullen has burst onto the memory scene over the last few years. He's also a firm believer that these memory techniques aren't just for show, but can help change the way we learn.
I felt like I didn't really have a very good memory. I was doing things in school and forgetting things and getting frustrated, and so I picked up this book called Moonwalking with Einstein by Joshua Foer that talks about memory competitions and memory techniques, and that's really what hooked me. Started to practice memorizing kind of silly things like numbers and decks of cards, and it kind of just hooked me. I mean, it's hard to describe, but it became like an obsession for me.
I remember when he first started doing it, because I thought it was hilarious, because Alex actually has a really bad memory in daily life, and I feel like I can say that because I'm his wife.
Alex and his wife, Kathy, are both medical students in Jackson, Mississippi. They took a year off to focus on memory. Alex became both the U.S. and world memory champion. When he returns to medical school this summer, he plans to use these techniques to help him study and learn.
My ability to come up with associations like that has definitely gotten better. I didn't consider myself to be a really creative person, and so I was worried about my ability to make associations, but it's definitely something that with practice you get better at, you get more creative, and it's very easy for me to think of things like that now.
He's a world record holder in speed cards, memorizing a shuffled deck of 52 cards in under 17 seconds.
These three principles, imagination, association, and location, were devised for learning, but they are also the same principles that lie behind creativity. So whenever you use these methods to increase your memory, you'll also be enhancing your capacity for original thought. Now let's look at the 5-step process of memorizing and learning. Whether you're memorizing a new fact or learning a new skill, the route to permanence is a 5-step process. Attention, emotional and sensory processing, the working memory, hippocampal processing, and finally consolidation. Step 1 is attention. The degree of focus we apply to an event determines how well we solidify that event in our memory. The thalamus activates neurons more intensely, while the frontal lobe inhibits other distractions. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. When you wander into a clearing and you suddenly come face to face with a lion, you don't need half your brain thinking how nice the berries on the far side look. Step 2 is the processing of the feelings associated with the event. This is split into 2 separate parts: emotion and sensation. Emotions are processed in the amygdala. The strong emotions increase our attention, making an event more likely to be encoded into memory. Meanwhile, signals from our sensory cortices are transferred to the hippocampus. If these sensory stimuli are of a high intensity, they increase the chances of recollection. Again, the benefits of this are fairly easy to see. If we burn ourselves on something hot, we want to remember not to touch the damn thing again. Step 3 is working memory. We've already covered our short-term memory in simple terms. It's a stepping stone on our way to our long-term memory. If we want information held here to become permanent, then we need Step 4, processing in the hippocampus. Important information is transferred to the hippocampus, where it's encoded. It can then loop back to the brain areas that first registered it to be recalled as a memory. We'll come back to this when we talk about association and memory cues. Finally, Step 5, consolidation. In this stage, neural firing patterns that encode an experience carry on looping from the hippocampus to the cortex, like forging a path through a field. The more the path is travelled, the more obvious and defined it becomes. But if it falls out of use, it will gradually become overgrown and disappear. If it's a new path, it takes a lot of footfall to forge the way, but over time it may become more akin to a solid tarmac surface that only needs the odd bit of maintenance. This consolidation of memories and skills is one of the most crucial elements in successful learning. Without consolidation, your chances of recalling something that you only experienced once rapidly drop to zero, and you may as well have not bothered in the first place. It is also why we must not focus on past mistakes. Each replay of that error or poor performance is forging a path in the wrong direction, taking us somewhere we don't want to be. When you catch yourself doing this, say stop, then identify the correct course of action and focus on that repeatedly to solidify the neural connection instead. These 5 steps together are what make the difference between perfect recall and instantly forgetting. To do armchair flying right, we need to finely tune, hone, or even just flat out manipulate each stage of this process. To do this, we can draw on some of the newly developed techniques and principles used by those athletes and memory champions we've already discussed. They're designed to enhance the way we learn and increase our memory power. Some of them are based on techniques that are thousands of years old, but more recently they've been combined with modern understandings of psychology and neuroscience to produce astounding, almost unbelievable feats of memorization and extreme athleticism. And the beautiful thing is, they're not skills we're born with, they're skills that can be learned and honed with practice. So let's start with step 1, attention. At the risk of stating the obvious, to maximize our attention, we need to increase our focus and minimize distractions, which is easier said than done in the world today. First and foremost, put the phone away. Turn off the laptop, rid yourself of all distractions, and ensure you have a nice, quiet room. Einstein once said, to quote him again, "Reading, after a certain age, diverts the mind too much from its creative pursuits. Any man who reads too much and uses his own brain too little falls into lazy habits of thinking." He said that in 1929, so Lord knows what he would have made of TV, let alone smartphones, laptops and tablets. Video streaming and social media mean we don't even have to engage our minds to conjure images off a written page anymore. They're just spoon-fed to us like pureed vegetables. In all seriousness, many psychologists believe this is becoming a genuine problem. And obviously I'm aware of the irony in saying this to you across the ether from an online platform. But if I can ask you to do one thing for me after this lesson, it won't be to hit that like button, share or subscribe for more content. It'll be to put the screen down and walk away. One of the best pieces of advice I received about focus was to flip the way I thought about it. Focus is not something you need to create or build. It's always there no matter what. But often it's buried under distractions. Finding focus isn't about adding things in, it's about taking things away. We'll hopefully cover mindfulness in a separate lesson altogether, but if you are finding it hard to reconnect with yourself, there are some great tools online. I use the Headspace app, but there's also a free mindfulness course on the DLE website. Both are great at taking those first steps in weaning yourself off distractions and technology. Next, craft your environment. In a famous experiment studying memory recall, a group of scuba divers were asked to learn a list of words. Some they learnt while they were on dry land, and some underwater. When they were later asked to recall these words, they found it easier to do so in the physical environment in which they had first memorized them. So it was easier to remember the words they had learnt in the water when they were actually underwater, and vice versa. This experiment suggests the environment itself provides a memory cue, and many pilots have reported similar things. If we could, the gold standard would be to do armchair flying in the actual cockpit, wearing all of the gear, but that's not always possible, not least because we want to form a habit. So this has to be easy to do, a quick 20 minutes, rather than being an onerous task. This is where vivid imagination provides a cheat code. With practice, we can conjure images of the sortie itself that are so vibrant and detailed that they trick our brains into believing they are real. And that's the key to armchair flying. We'll cover how to do it shortly. We'll hopefully have a separate lesson on habit forming as well. But put in simple terms, we want to prime our brain. By armchair flying at the same time and the same place every day, we condition the brain to think, oh, this is where we visualize. As time progresses, it will begin to click straight into that focused state, bypassing the initial slog. It's the same state we want when we fly, focused, undistracted, confident, sharp and prepared. Habits are powerful tools as well. They make life exponentially easier and more productive. Once established, you don't have to ponder when you'll revise or when you'll work out in the gym. You don't have to badger yourself into it. It just happens at the same time, same place, every day. So, now that we've covered attention, let's return to our 5 steps. The second one is processing. Once we've focused on an event, we then automatically process how we feel about it, emotionally and through our senses. Emotionally charged events and strong sensations burn themselves into our memory quickly. We remember them more readily. This is great, but a lot of what we have to learn is not particularly interesting, especially if it's dry semantic knowledge like a long list of pre-start checks. So what we're going to do is exploit the brain's preference for high-octane events and the fact it can't tell the difference between imagined events and reality. By applying a set of visualization techniques that draw on our full range of sensations, emotions, and our imagination, combined with systemic consolidation, we can indelibly burn even the most mundane knowledge and sequences into our memory. The broader term for this substituting of the mundane for the memorable is mnemonics. Research shows that students who use mnemonic techniques, such as visualization and memory palaces, consistently and significantly outperform those who don't. The following is a checklist of the elements involved in visualization and the techniques you can apply to make your armchair flying more vivid and memorable. If it's used properly, it can make the difference between instantly recalling the immediate actions for an emergency or drawing a blank and potentially failing a sortie. The first on the list is synesthesia. This is the blending of all our senses. It's easy to think only about sight when we think of visualization, but if a song or a smell has ever transported you back to a memory of a time and place, you'll understand how effective that can be. So the key to imagery is to use them all, a polysensory experience, which involves all relevant senses from vision to hearing, smell, taste, touch, and the last, kinesthesia. This is the awareness of your bodily position and movement in space. Using sound, for example, might be hearing the change in engine note during a helicopter auto-rotation, or the sound of a stall warner during a max rate turn in a Texan. Smells might be that familiar Avtur scent walking out to the flight line, or you might use it to imagine the aroma of cooked chicken to practice what you're going to go through when you have an engine intake bird strike. Touch can be the imagining of the friction on the throttle or the feeling of the textured flying gloves. Taste doesn't come into it too much when we fly, other than perhaps the salty sweat in your mouth. But it can be used as an association tool. Memorizing the rules pertaining to icing, for example, by linking them to ice cream, can be a wonderful trigger. We'll cover that technique later. Kinesthetic sense is the feel or sensation of the body as it moves in different positions. The kinesthetic sense would be important for a pilot using imagery to practice a complex sequence of checks, feeling where his hand moves for each selection, or feeling how the stick forces change during a loop, or the pedal input required as a helicopter lifts into the hover. The more detailed, realistic and vivid your armchair flying is, the more effective it will be. Movement is important because, with an evolutionary past as both predator and prey, our brains evolved to highlight and prioritize motion. It also adds another giant range of possibilities in any mnemonic image for your brain to link in and thus remember. As your images move, it makes your mind see them as three-dimensional events, which adds depth and realism. Association. Our brains are an infinitely complex neural network of interconnecting pathways that constantly grow to build new associations. As each new piece of knowledge is added into the system, it is connected with existing understanding to create a mental model of the world around us. Whatever you wish to memorize, make sure you associate it or link it to something stable in your mental environment. This is how the mind palaces work, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. Sexuality, well, we all have a good memory here, so use it. Feel free to make your images vulgar or outrageous. Nobody needs to know what imagery you're using. Humour, the more absurd or funny an image, the more your brain will be attracted to it. Draw from comedy films, sketches, cartoons, or real-life incidents, whatever makes you laugh. Imagination, well, I've already stressed the importance of this. It's a force multiplier. The more you apply your imagination to memory, the better your memory will be. Order, sequence and numbering. Putting things into a logical sequence allows for a more immediate recall, and it increases the brain's possibilities for random access. It's about creating that logical library reference system we talked about. Symbolism. This is all about substituting a boring or ordinary byte of information with a more meaningful image, which increases the probability of recall. This is how the guys can memorize pi to 70,000 digits, and in recent years, I've started using it more and more to remember dry facts and figures that otherwise just wouldn't stick. Colour? Well, where appropriate and whenever possible, use the full range of the rainbow to make your ideas more colourful and therefore more memorable. Positive images. In most instances, positive and pleasant images are better for memory purposes because it makes the brain want to return to those images. Certain negative images, even if they apply all of the above principles, and even if they are inherently memorable, may be blocked by the brain just because it finds the prospect of returning to such images unpleasant. Emotion. In addition to the senses, we should also imagine the emotions associated with various experiences. This is an important part of imagery. We can use armchair flying to help control anxiety, anger, or adrenaline by recreating those emotions in our minds. For example, it helps to recreate the thoughts and feelings experienced during a test to understand how anxiety can hurt our performance. Everyone suffers from pre-test nerves, and trust me, I mean everyone. You won't get rid of pre-test nerves, but you can use armchair flying to become accustomed to them instead. However, we can also recreate our past performances in our minds to remember the emotions associated with those experiences, such as elation, satisfaction, pride and self-esteem, and this strengthens the pathways that trigger that confidence. Exaggeration. In all your images, exaggerate size, shape, colour and sound. Make it massive, loud, bright and obscene. Cadence. When athletes practice visualization, they ensure their imagery moves at the same pace as the real-life timing, not rushing through it or inching along. This is important to increase realism, and it also embeds the correct cadence in our minds. However, you will note that this represents some difficulties when armchair flying for a 1 hour and 15-minute long sortie, so I recommend you break it up into its constituent parts, rerunning each individual element until you achieve your aim, and make no mistakes. This also avoids the problem of overemphasizing the first part of a flight and neglecting the latter stages when you get bored or distracted. Students being weak or fuzzy on the after landing checks or the shutdown checks is a common issue. And last but by no means least, controllability. We've already touched on this and it ties in with positive images. Remember that visualization can hurt your performance if you're focusing on negative imagery, remembering past mistakes or picturing yourself failing a sortie. We instead need to control our mental images to craft in our minds the perfect flight and then repeatedly practice the correct actions over and over and over again, forging that pathway. This is where developing our powers of controllability comes in. We must learn to direct our imagery, and if we're to use it effectively as a mental training tool. Controllability is the ability to imagine exactly what we intend to do, and the ability to manipulate aspects of those images we wish to change. Dreams, for the most part, are uncontrollable. We simply experience them during sleep. Armchair flying, by contrast, must be controllable so that we can manipulate the scenario in productive ways to program ourselves for optimal performance. Now, in this list, I know there's a lot of overlap here, but by thinking about and applying all of these elements and techniques, you'll really be able to ramp up the effectiveness of your study. So, back to our 5 steps, and step 3, working memory. Now that we have our vivid image in our working memory, we need to store it. This is done by step 4, processing in the hippocampus. We've talked about imagination in step 2, the conjuring of the image. Step 4 is where the other 2 pillars of association and location really come into play. Processing in the hippocampus is where our memories are filed, tagged, and linked. So let's look first at association to see how we can tweak and fine-tune it to get the most out of it. The first key element in learning any facts, figures, lists, or procedures is interest. For obvious reasons, your brain is designed to remember interesting things. Thankfully, despite how it may appear, interest and fascination can be cultivated. Our sense of curiosity grows the more we know about the world. Almost any subject is fascinating from a certain perspective. You just have to find that hook that works for you. I'm sure you'll have seen this at school. Interesting teachers make subjects interesting. The only difference now is that the onus is on us to find the intrigue in any topic we need to understand. The other important aspect of association is finding relevance. In an aircraft fire, for example, your immediate actions may include isolating the hydraulics. This is done because hydraulic fluid is flammable. Now, without that specific piece of knowledge, isolating the hydraulics seems like a rather arbitrary step in the checklist, and it's therefore forgettable. But when you have that piece of knowledge, that hyd fluid is flammable, your brain knows why we do it, and it will integrate and associate its mental model of both hydraulic systems and the fire drill. This interlacing connectivity is what makes association such a powerful tool. Now let's look at location. A mind palace, or to give its more formal title, location-based mnemonics, uses images of realistic places to commit huge amounts of information to memory by combining visual and spatial memory. You might have seen them used in fiction by heroes and villains ranging from Sherlock Holmes to Hannibal Lecter. But let's just bring it down to reality a bit. Despite the name, this method of location doesn't have to be grandiose or pretentious. The aim is just to have an anchor for the information somewhere, rather than having it floating around. For example, if you're learning aircraft tech, imagine yourself in the hangar or on the flight line. Picture each piece of information as a physical thing and place it on tables or sit it on the aircraft itself. If you're learning operating procedures perhaps, like reading the flying order book, then imagine the squadron operations room. It doesn't have to be mundane or even accurate. It can be a fantastical version of that room, filled with ridiculous characters like Daffy Duck, Deadpool, or Donald Trump, whatever helps you remember the contents of the manuals through association. When you create a location like this, you must dedicate some time to it. Make sure you know the layout. This is why it's often best to use somewhere very familiar like home, the squadron, or the aircraft itself. Then establish the permanent items, such as a table, the door, a bookcase, or in the case of the aircraft, parts like the pitot or the aerials. These items then become permanent hooks on which you can hang your information for later retrieval. If you want to use your palace to remember a sequence, then you need to determine a set route through it, one that never changes, so that you can retrieve items from the hooks in the correct order. The memory champions dedicate hours and hours of visualization to their palaces and can do astounding things, but I'm not a big fan of memory tricks that have no useful application. I do practice memorizing a randomly shuffled deck of cards, which I can do in about 6 minutes, nowhere near the 17 seconds that the champions can do. But I find this acts as a useful mental workout, almost like a warm-up akin to a morning stretch. For my mind palace, I use the house I grew up in, placing each card with an associated image at each location. The kitchen door is number 1, the table number 2, then the dresser on my left is 3, and so on. I use this sequence whenever I have to give a speech, placing a sentence or a paragraph at each location. However, when I revise aircraft tech, I imagine the aircraft itself, with objects and items placed around it to help me remember the specifics. These may take the form of post-it notes, images that remind me of things, or even pieces of string tied from one switch to another to remind me of an association between the two. It's amazing how silly things like that can jog your memory, even under the duress of a stressful sortie. This sort of technique can take time and requires a lot of visualization, but it can really pay dividends. And as the world memory champion at the start said, the more you practice making these associations, the quicker you'll become and the easier it will be. Our final step in the process is consolidation. The elephant in the room when it comes to learning and consolidation is sleep. It's only recently that scientists have discovered just how important sleep is when it comes to learning. It now transpires that the storage consolidation happens primarily while we sleep. During this time, your brain is not processing information from the outside world, so it can carry out these essential housekeeping tasks. Knowledge and experiences are sorted, prioritized, and the gist extracted. They also link in with all memories already in storage. This makes it easier to retrieve information in the future. Studies have also shown it's actually more beneficial to take a nap after learning something new rather than to keep studying. The old notions of pulling an all-nighter need to be dashed. Sacrificing sleep in favour of revision is like continually adding ingredients to a cake mix and expecting it to taste great by morning without actually baking it. All you'll end up with is a sloppy mixture. Sleep bakes knowledge and skills into our brains, but it does more than that. It also changes the end result for the better. Studies have shown that the adage, practice makes perfect, is incomplete. Sleep not only solidifies a skill, it actually improves it. So the true motto actually needs to be, practice and sleep make perfect. Next, have a revision strategy. With a clearly defined stretch goal, this is what is known as deliberate practice. Make it time-based and measured, properly plan it out. Decide what aspects you are going to armchair fly, almost like a sortie profile, and track your performance. For example, you might decide to spend 20 minutes visualizing all elements of a flapless circuit, with the goal being to do it without making any errors. After each attempt, give yourself immediate and informative feedback, so have the FRCs or aircrew manual to hand. If you don't do armchair flying in a continuous and systematic manner, it just won't qualify as mental training. Dreaming or random imagery is not systematic, and there's no evidence that this type of imagery enhances performance. This doesn't mean that you have to spend numerous hours every day engaged in visualization for it to help, but you must use it in some sort of continuing, organized manner, even if in small doses, to have the desired effect. This is similar to continuation training that's done on the front line. If you just take an aircraft and bomb about for an occasional, unstructured flight profile, it won't do anything to increase or refresh your skills. However, systematic, repetitive practice has been clearly shown to pay off. Track your results and amend your strategy to focus on areas where you're weakest. You can't manage what you can't measure, and if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. Consistent documentation leads to consistent growth. It doesn't matter if you use a journal, a notebook, or even just your phone, but be consistent. Stick with it until tracking your revision becomes a habit. When you plan your sessions, use spacing. Spreading your practice out over time, gradually reducing as that skill improves. If you learn something just once, over time that memory trace will fade and the connections will weaken. It's sometimes referred to as the forgetting curve. The more times you practice or revise something, the stronger those connections between neurons will become, and the more likely you are to remember it in the future. Spacing, if done correctly, is the most efficient way of halting this decline. Essentially, what it means is that it's better to revise 10 minutes a day for 6 days than it is to revise for just 1 hour on a single day that week. Remember that over time, as the path becomes more permanent, you can gradually reduce the amount of consolidation you commit to that one particular skill until it requires just a little top-up maintenance from time to time. Finally, recall rehearsal. This is the practice of learning by explaining things to others. There's an old saying, to teach is to learn twice. Even if you feel like you've grasped a subject, you don't truly understand something until you can explain it to somebody else. However, even just repeating something out loud to yourself or to an imaginary audience is often enough to solidify ideas in our minds or highlight areas where we're fuzzy. We'll hopefully cover study skills, deliberate practice and goal setting in separate lessons. But for now, I hope this has given you a better understanding of armchair flying, visualization, and learning and memorization as a whole. In conclusion, ... to be finished.